Will Nintendo Switch take the crown as the best-selling console of all time? I was asked by a viewer of this channel to take a look at the likelihood of this, but I must admit I was stumped as to where to even start. However, after giving it some thought, I think I've devised a few strategies that could help us determine the likelihood of this happening, and along the way, I fix what appears to be a calculation error in Nintendo's spreadsheets. You're welcome, Furukawa-san. So, let's look at the numbers as they stand. At the end of the 2023-24 financial year, there were 141.32 million units of Nintendo Switches sold, and they're forecasting 13.5 million for the next financial year. That takes them to 154.82 million units. Meanwhile, the PlayStation 2 has the crown for the top console, but its precise tally is a little ambiguous. I don't think you can hold against the PS2 that some people bought it not for its games but as a cheap DVD player. All's fair in love and sales, but there is another area of ambiguity. Sony Interactive Entertainment President and CEO Jim Ryan confirmed that the PS2 hit 160 million units in worldwide sales, but it isn't entirely clear if he was rounding up, perhaps as a way to try to yank the prize a little further out of Switch's hands with some creative ambiguity, as this was higher than the previous public figure mentioned. Of course, it's also possible he was rounding down, and the PS2 had a long tail of sales long after we thought it was selling, which went underreported but accumulated to take the PlayStation 2 into the low 160s. I don't think Sony are going to rush to provide clarity, as I'm sure they will want to cling on to the prestige of being the highest selling console of all time for as long as they can. What this means is that in order for us to feel confident that the Nintendo Switch is truly and definitively in the lead, it really needs to clear that 160 million mark with change, or else it will always be seen as being one of the two highest selling consoles in the ballpark, but not necessarily the one true king. And with the successor console hoving into view, it has to generate these sales against the backdrop of a relatively slim lineup. So first of all, let's see how accurate Nintendo's own forecasts are. After all, if Nintendo can't even snag the 13.5 million they're gunning for this year, how on earth are they going to mop up a further 6 or so million to take them home and dry? This year they forecast 15 million, and they ended up with 15.7 million. But in the 2022-23 fiscal year, they ended up with 17.97 million sold, against a forecast of 21 million units. It's tricky to go back further as we hit the pandemic years, and before that the outsized growth of Switch, which throws the data a little. It's curious though that the drop-off they're forecasting from the previous year is going to be less proportionately, 14%, compared to the drop-off they forecast the previous year, which was 16.5%. And that's despite the fact that last year they knew they were onto a banger year because they had the Super Mario Bros. Movie, Tears of the Kingdom, and Super Mario Bros. Wonder. You would expect a lesser drop-off in such a fantastic year, which makes me think that they still have something big up their sleeve for 2024 to 2025. So look, Nintendo's forecasts are good, but not infallible. If anyone can relate, I can. Still, to dig a bit deeper, let's look at this document, which is the Consolidated Sales Transition by Region document, freshly updated for 2024. Now, because it's denominated in units of tens of thousands, the numbers aren't enormously intuitive to look at, but basically we can see that it says 14,132, 10,000 sold, which in more natural language means 141.32 million copies of the Switch being sold. But there's also a breakdown by the different types and models of system, and understanding the life cycles of each of these individual models may be instructive. We know that there were 93.45 million classic Switches, 24.34 Switch OLEDs, and 23.54 Switch Lites sold. Of course, I'm talking in millions here. We'll come to the different models in a second, but firstly, let's pivot to some of the previous consoles, because knowing the late-stage performance of prior consoles may give us a good insight into the potential fate of the Switch. So here is the Nintendo 3DS. Total hardware sales of 75.94 million units, and this breaks down into several different sections. Now, the first thing looking at this data, I instantly smelled a rat, because there was no way it seemed to me that a late-stage iteration like the new 2DS XL, great though it was, topped out the top-of-the-line new 3DS XL, which had been on sale all those years. So I ran Nintendo's numbers myself on the additional column to the right, literally just a sum of their year-by-year numbers to compare to their life-to-date totals, and sure enough, there is a discrepancy. It seems, and I could be missing something obvious, so please check for yourself, but it seems like the life-to-date totals do not correspond to the correct systems. So they've attributed the new Nintendo 3DS sales to the new Nintendo 3DS XL, the new 3DS XL sales to the new 2DS XL, and the 2DS XL sales to the new Nintendo 3DS. In this case, the final numbers, going by totaling the yearly sales but not relying on Nintendo's own life-to-date column, should break down as follows. The best-selling console, or the best-selling version, I should say, of the 3DS was the 3DS XL, at 19.64 million units sold, followed by the 2DS at 10.5 million units, then the new Nintendo 3DS XL with 12.26 million, then the new Nintendo 2DS XL with 4.8 million, and finally the new Nintendo 3DS at 2.51 million. And let's just look at the year-by-year numbers a little. The 3DS's total hardware sales was 3.61 million in its first financial year. But remember, the system had only been on the market 5 weeks during that period. Therefore, it maintained in the region of 12 to 14 million a year for a few years before dropping down in 2014 to 15, 8.7 million, then 6.8 million, then 7.3 million in the financial year ending 2017. The financial year, remember, that ended with the launch of Switch. But sales did not dive off a cliff. In fact, they shifted 6.4 million in 2017-18, despite the existence of a console that was clearly lined up as a successor to it in the portable space. Then in 2018-19, 2.55 million 3DS consoles were sold, largely wrapping up the 3DS's library. In the 2019-20 year, Switch Lite was released, and if the Switch seemed like a successor system, then the Switch Lite really was, being a pure handheld at a cheaper price point. That fiscal year, they still shifted 0.69 million 3DS units, and 0.17 million shifted in the financial year ending 2021. Basically, it was quite a protracted end to the system. Of course, Nintendo did continue to support the 3DS for a good long time with significant games like Metroid Samus Returns, cross-gen titles like Captain Toad and so on coming in the later years, to say nothing, of course, of big Pokemon titles like Ultra Sun and Ultra Moon. It seems unlikely that Switch will be dumped unceremoniously when the new console hoves into view, and with the console being cross-gen, there is still the potential for big titles to release. If the next Mario Kart game is cross-generational, given that the Switch still does not have its own exclusive mainline Mario Kart title, that might prompt some people to search out a discount old Switch Lite. And they may continue to issue ports and remasters of older games to capitalise on the large Switch install base, since it will be some time, if ever, before the successor console reaches such a significant number of active players. If we assume, therefore, that the 2024-25 lineup for Switch will be the equivalent of the 2017-28 sales year for the 3DS, a drier but not yet desiccated lineup, we can look to the 3DS precedent and see that sales did not really fall off a cliff in that year. One way to see the pace of the drop-off is simply to calculate the New Year's sales as a percentage of the previous years. The 2018-19 sales were about 40% of the previous year. Now, it should be said that this was against the backdrop of some insanely good deals on the hardware. The 2DS was about $80 outright, if I recall, and obviously even the top-of-the-line hardware was a good bit cheaper than the original Switch. Still, the decline was relatively gradual. Let's look by contrast at the Nintendo DS. The data is on screen, but to fit it in, I've shrunk the more recent columns. The data is all on Nintendo's website if you want to follow along at home, and I'll put the link underneath the video. In the financial year 2011-12, after the 3DS had been on the market for 1 to 13 months, the DS shifted 5.1 million copies, around 29% of the previous financial year, and then it sold 2.35 million in the year thereafter, which was 46% of the preceding year. With 3DS, the 2018-19 year was 40% of the previous year, and then the following year was 27% that year. The numbers are different, but the proportionate drop-off isn't completely on another planet. With the Wii, it's a slightly different matter as the drop-off started earlier, and I've shown on screen the percentage drops year on year. With successive years from the 2009-10 financial year, they were starting to see big drop-offs in sales compared to the previous years. With the Wii U releasing in November 2012, the 2012 to 13 years saw figures 40% the previous year, and the year after was 30% of that year, then 38% of the previous year, then 24% the previous year. All these consoles have very different circumstances, and comparing like with like is incredibly tricky, but there seems to be a pattern that the consoles declined relatively gradually while they were still being supported, matching around 70 to 90% of their previous year's sales, but once the cord was pulled and the writing was truly on the wall, we'd see sales be more like 30 to 40% of the previous year. And of course these numbers compound so that 2 years on it would be 30% of 30%, so in the region of 10% compared to 2 years before. Therefore, let's assume that the Switch makes 13.5 million this year, as forecast by Nintendo themselves, and this brings their lifetime totals to 254.82 million units. If the 2025 to 26 year sees sales decline in a similar sort of pattern to the very late stage 3DS, 30% of 13.5 million would be 4.05 million. So that would bring Nintendo's total to 158.87 million. Then a 30% of 4.05 million would bring us to 1.22 million, which would take Nintendo over the line to 160.09 million units of Switch sold by the end of March 2027. I haven't needed to use any wild numbers. 30% is on the lower end of the central estimate of the drop-off, but of course the Switch has also gone on longer without a successor than prior consoles, so perhaps that's fair enough. The most wobbly number I've used is Nintendo's own forecast figures, but presumably they have some kind of basis for this confidence, although I guess the cynical part of me thinks that if the numbers are overly optimistic, by the time the truth is revealed, we'll be so far down the hype tunnel for the next system that perhaps it won't matter so much for Nintendo's investors. Still, I can see a route to Nintendo reaching 160 million Switches sold, and so I'm going to give it as a 70% forecast that this will happen, if not by the end of financial year 26-27, then by the end of the financial year 2027 to 2028. I will confess a little bit of bias, as for a very long time I felt, just instinctively, that it would reach that threshold, but looking at the numbers I do think there's reason to believe that this judgment is accurate. However, what is your forecast? Pop it in the comments, and then in years to come you can point to it as proof of your forecasting skills. Once again, thank you so much for watching, and I will see you next time for another Nintendo forecast.